Okay, awesome. So it's 5 o'clock and I want to get us started right on time. So hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the role of technology in circular fashion. My name is Tanvi. I work at Tamarind Chutney, which is a sustainable and ethical apparel brand. We are very excited to be collaborating with Chintan Environmental Research and Action Group to organize a series of webinars, largely on the topic of circular economy, and the first two specifically on circular fashion. So a little bit about Chintan. I think the name is familiar to most here, but Chintan is a nonprofit that works on sustainability through the lens of solid and hazardous waste and air pollution. They've been working in this space for nearly 2 decades now, and have recently specifically started looking at the fashion space through the lens of textile waste and circular fashion. We are very honored to be collaborating with them as they kick off some of their first projects in this space. And I would like to introduce Bharti Chaturvedi, who's the founder and director of Chintan. And Bharti will be kicking us off for this webinar. Over to you, Bharti.
Thanks, Tanvi, and thank you everyone for being here. This is our second webinar, and the first one set the context on circular fashion in India. And the second one is specifically about technology and the role that tech can play in getting us towards circular fashion. And all of our webinars, these two, and we have 4 more ahead, have been made possible by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Most of you know the FES if you've been attending these webinars and otherwise. But the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is a non-profit German foundation that's committed to the values of democracy and social justice. And with these webinar series, what FES kind of wants to create is a more nuanced and a progressive discourse for social, economic, and ecological transformation with gender justice and climate justice at its core. And you'll see that reflected in all of these webinars as you attend them. So I just wanted to say a couple of things. Tech and innovation just isn't an exciting topic, but it's actually the need of the hour. And if you want to move from linear to circular in any kind of field, you do need to examine tech, because tech is actually very important for this shift. And to understand why we've got Charanya from Tamarind Chutney, who's going to give us a kind of short introduction on why we need tech in circular fashion. And she's going to take us through the journey of an activewear t-shirt. And right after that, we're going to have about a 40-minute conversation with our absolutely outstanding panelists, as you'll realize when you listen to them. And then we open it to the audience for a Q&A. So I have a quick request. There's a section, a Q&A box. So just post your questions there and not in the chat, and we'll pick those up. And in the chat, just feel free to chat, with each other and so on, because the whole idea is also for people to meet each other. So with that, over to Charanya. Charanya?
Thank you, Bharti, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. It's great to see all of you and so many attendees. We're super excited to get started. Now, our last webinar was about circular fashion in India, which to a large extent is based on the methods of conservative and judicious use of resources that are available to us. At an individual level, we do play our part in being responsible consumers, but for a large scale shift to happen, we really need the big guys of the industry to chip in and pool in their resources and work, because right now we can't afford to ignore the scale at which these technological changes can benefit us, them, and the world. I'll be taking you through the process of an athleisure t-shirt, the manufacturing of an athleisure t-shirt. Now, as we all know, we all own at least a t-shirt, whether we are an athlete or not. We love to lounge in them. We love to go for a walk, sweat in them. It dries really quickly because of the characteristics of the fabric that it is made out of, and it's just super comfortable. So I don't think it's something that we can give up and move to, our conventional cotton t-shirts. So this is a process about how this kind of a t-shirt is made and how technology in particular is used to make this t-shirt. Now, obviously, like large companies have really sophisticated processes and stuff, but it all comes down to the basics, which is all your t-shirts come from the same chemicals as a PET bottle, which is your Coke bottles, which are your water bottles. It's the same chemicals, which are dimethyl terephthalate, which is reacted with ethylene glycol. I had to write this down because they're tough chemicals. They undergo a chemical reaction with a catalyst under high pressure and temperature to form a polymer resin, which is then cooled and stored as chips. Now, this is a highly chemical inducive process where all the raw materials are from petroleum and can cause a much larger carbon footprint than conventional cotton. Now, these chips can either be dyed at the chip stage if the color is finalized, and if the color is not finalized, then they're extruded, just like how noodles are extruded through metal containers through tiny holes. The same way these chips are extruded into filament yarns. Now, the dyeing can happen either at the chip stage or at this yarn stage. And since this is a fully chemical synthetic yarn, only synthetic dyes can be used to dye this, as opposed to cotton yarn, which can obviously be dyed using either natural dyes or slightly chemical synthetic dyes. Now, these long and continuous yarns are then cut up into shorter fibers, which are then blended with cotton in this specific t-shirt, where you can have different percentages of blends to help with the characteristic of what your end use is going to be of the performance garment. If you wanted to dry fast, if you wanted to, stick to your body so that it can aerodynamically increase your speed in water or wherever you want to use it. And most of this process is also used to make polyfill, which is microplastics, which are used to stuff your cushions and your comforters and your pillows. Now, to our next step of the garment manufacturing process, this yarn is then taken into another processing unit where this yarn is then knitted into fabrics. Now, it's exactly how it sounds. It's exactly like your grandmother's knitting it, but it's just a machine using hundreds and thousands of needles to interloop this fabric to create interloop this yarn to create a fabric. Now, this fabric is then layered into multiple layers, and the parts of the garment are drawn out on sheets of paper. The sheets of paper are then used to put it on top of the layers of the fabric and then cut using a mechanized machine. Now, they try and minimize the production waste over here, but whatever said and done, there is at least 30% of wastage happens on this cutting floor where the unused fabric is just thrown out at this stage. Now, these cut panels are then taken into a factory, and these t-shirts are stitched, often by underpaid workers in developing countries. Once these t-shirts are stitched, they go through a thorough quality check where even a slight defect can get the garment rejected. After the QC is done, all the garments are shipped out. More sophisticated factories produce up to 5,000 t-shirts daily. And when you have such a large scale of production, there is also large scale reject that happens. Many companies have doubled their output since the year 2000, which leads to overproduction, overconsumption, and faster disposal. Some people do practice thrifting and passing down of garments, but it's not surprising if the garment is discarded much faster after a few wears. As you can see, every step of this process is polluting, and most of the pollution happens even before it reaches the consumer. When we talk about garment pollution, we mostly only talk about packaging or post-consumer pollution, but the pollution caused by processing of the fibers and the fabric is often left out of the sustainability conversation. We need each process each stage of this process to change to be truly zero waste. And technological innovation is the key, for which we have a wonderful panel to discuss the way in which technology can be an asset to this change, and an awesome moderator who will take us through this discussion. I welcome Lavanya Garg, who is our moderator for the session. Lavanya is passionate about gender, people operations, and sustainable fashion. She is Chief of Staff and Senior Manager at Good Business Lab, a labor research company where she joined as the first employee in 2017. She also co-runs India's first sustainable fashion community, Sustainable Styles Speak, SAS, with over 1,000 members. SAS curates learning opportunities to help entrepreneurs and students build meaningful careers. Lavanya holds an MA in International and Development Economics from Yale and a BA in Economics from Lady Shri Ram College. Welcome, Lavanya.
Thanks so much, Charanya, and thanks for the overview. I definitely learned a lot from it, and I think a lot of people heard it too. So I'll introduce our panelists. We have Priyanka Khanna, who's a business development and partnership expert. She holds an MBA from Oxford University and currently serves as the International Expansion Manager for the South Asia Innovation Program at Fashion for Good, which helps organizations pilot, scale, and access investments for innovations driving the apparel industry towards a circular economy. We have Karan Kumar, who's a program officer in the materials vertical at Laudes Foundation, which catalyzes systems change in specific industries through philanthropic capital, expertise, and connections to build towards a climate positive and inclusive economy. He focuses on making the textile and apparel industry sustainable by supporting the transition to a restorative, regenerative, and just material system. We also have Dr. Deepti Gupta. She's a professor in the Department of Textile Technology at IIT Delhi. She has over 30 years of teaching and research experience and has published more than 100 papers in national and international journals of repute. Her specializations include the finishing of textiles using eco-friendly materials, design and engineering of functional clothing, and textile chemistry, including surface functionalization and multifunctional finishes using natural materials. And lastly, we have Gauri Sharma, who's an organizational development manager at Shahi Exports, one of India's largest apparel manufacturers in India. She has experience working with all stakeholders in the supply chain to deliver innovative solutions to pressing social and environmental challenges. In her master's thesis at Cambridge University, she evaluated buyer-supplier collaborations to understand the challenges in the industry's transition to a circular economy. She's also my co-founder at SAS. Cool, so we'll dive into the moderator Q&A, which is about 30 minutes, and then take questions from the audience. So this is a common question for all panelists. Any or all of you can answer, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Can you define circularity based on how your organization or you personally view this, and how, in your opinion, it translates to practice?
I can start if that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, I did research circularity as part of my master's. So when I started doing this research, there were so many definitions that I got really confused. They're all similar, but still slightly different. But I found this one definition by this academic. His name is Guy Stoffer, and he basically defines it as a regenerative system in which all resources, inputs, emissions, energy leakage is all minimized, whether that's through long-lasting design, maintenance, repair, reuse, remanufacturing, recycling. So when I started studying circularity in the beginning, I thought it was just recycling, like that was the meaning of circularity, but I realized there's many other ways to kind of prevent waste and throughout the supply chain.
That was quite amazing, Gauri. If I was to just add something, I think from my point of view, and honestly, these definitions change a lot for everyone individually. I think waste is a key component. And if I was to define as one of the top few things in defining circularity, it's how we can potentially eliminate waste from the entire process, find ways to recapture the value out of that waste, and then make sure newer materials, existing processes now use this recaptured material instead of creating newer materials. I think to me, in short, I mean, if we expand on the definition, there's a lot to it. But in short, for the industry, at least for fashion industry, that's what it would mean.
I think I tend to agree. And I think one thing that I would just add from our perspective is also the concept of value, where a circular economy is really trying to change the value of things that are already being used, right? For different production processes, and realizing that it's not just financial value that is important is also another thing that hopefully sort of indicates what a circular economy is really all about.
Thanks for that, Gauri, Priyanka, and Karan. Dr. Deepti, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, hi. So, as technocrats and in the research domain, we actually do not use these terms in these sense. When I look at, circular economy and, these are more, I feel, from the marketing point of view or from the consumer point of view. What we do is, if I was, for example, to define it, it is like we understand that textile processing, which is the area in which I work on, is one of the most polluting areas in the, supply chain of textile production. So when I work in these areas, I'm trying to, for example, make the process benign. So it's chemical intensive, it is energy intensive, it is water intensive. That's what we define as being non-eco-friendly. And when I try to do work in that area, I try to find technologies where we substitute the damaging chemicals with other technologies or less damaging chemicals, and make the process which will make use of less water, less energy, and more eco-friendly in that sense. Because, when you say circular and all, it's more related to the consumer end. And very often in research, we are not really looking at that. It's more like exploring and finding ways of, finding better technologies. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, those are great points. And I'll actually come back to the role of consumers and also your work with natural dyes. But before we do that, I think it'll be good to get a sense of the landscape. And I'll start with you, Priyanka. You've seen a lot of startups. Can you share information about 2-3 startups that are using technology to build a more circular fashion industry?
Super hard because there's so many and there's so many great ones. But if we talk about particularly circularity, I think I'd like to cite some examples then from India. We have technologies like Lucro, which is essentially collecting all sorts of plastic waste from various manufacturers and then recycling it, even de-inking it to some extent and putting it back and sending it back to the manufacturers to reuse in newer processes. So a good example of that would be where work with Wellspun India, wherein they've actually taken the films that are used to package some of the materials that Wellspun sends to various brands across the world, but there is wastage in that process. So that wastage is then captured back and sent to Lucro, and Lucro then recycles this and creates new films for their processes. So that is pretty much closing the loop, because they do still have to use a percentage of virgin plastic in it, but the huge component of it is still recycled already. And the hope is the technology further develops to start doing more 100%, up to 100%, let's say, of materials. Another great technology like that would be Purify. It's not necessarily from India, but they're also setting up in India. So I thought that would be a great example of closing the loop at the end of the supply chain. Purify is a technology that is taking waste. So I think in Charanya's presentation, she spoke about 30% is the cutting waste from the factory floor itself. So that waste right now, or to quite an extent, either lands up into landfills or it goes for downcycling. So it can be used in rags, it can be used in other industries. Upcycling or downcycling, it's still not being circular by nature because it's not necessarily going back into the same industry. So Purify has created technology, well, two aspects of it. One, scanning technologies on factory floors so that they can actually track what type of material waste it is. And second, they're actually using enzyme process to recycle that. And then that recycled material goes as new fibers to various manufacturers who then further spin them into yarns and then fabrics and goes into newer manufacturing. So they Purify actually is in the process of setting up in India, but they do have a plant in Belgium, and they've done a lot of trials with Indian manufacturers as well. So maybe I want to talk about two more. Gravity Labs, which is another fantastic company out of India, is actually capturing pollution, and they're extracting carbon out of pollution and making inks from that. So these inks, they've actually done collections with some brands. They've done some inks for printing. But now there is full potential of using these inks for dyeing and printing processes in the fashion industry. And they've already tested this out with Pangaya. They're also now testing it with a few other partners. But it's fantastic because pollution is actually all of our waste, which is now can potentially replace existing synthetic inks in the market. And I think last I want to bring up, because I think it's important when we talk about circular business models, to also look at models like rentals, because on the consumer end, it's still rotating the materials and keeping it in action longer rather than it turning into waste. So I think another great technology there is Trove, which is actually working with brands. It's a white labeling solution for brands where they do the whole logistics and make it easier for brands to bring back their materials and also sell it secondhand. So a lot of these companies on the rental side exist in India as well. And we are hoping for winners like Trove to come out of India soon enough. Yeah, that would be, sorry, I went up to 4 technologies.
No, that's super useful. And I want to follow up with Gauri because she represents an industry player. And I know a lot of your startups actually work directly with manufacturers, like you mentioned the Wellspun example. So Gauri, from Shahi's perspective, what kind of trends are you seeing in terms of the demand for the kind of technology that's there from the manufacturer side?
Yeah, definitely. And we are running some pilots with Fashion for Good and our brand partners as well. Some of the trends, Priyanka already mentioned the types of companies that they are working with and incubating. Similarly, at Shahi, for example, we're seeing a high demand for, recycling of the cutting waste, which even in the beginning, which was highlighted as a huge problem in the fashion industry, anywhere up to, there's different estimates, but it can be anywhere up to 20% of the fabric ending up as cutting waste. And for a manufacturer, fabric can be up to 50 to 60% of the cost of the garment. So it's actually a financial loss as well. So we're exploring different ways to recycle this waste, particularly cotton cutting waste, and convert it back into yarn. One thing that we have established at commercial scale is mechanical recycling of this waste and converting it back into yarn. There's a lot of demand for this, so this has been successful for us. But we're also exploring other more modern technologies, which use, not just mechanical, but chemical recycling as well. Trying to figure out how it can go back into cotton yarn, or even something like viscose. Can cotton waste be converted to pulp for viscose, for example? These are some of the trends in the cutting waste space. Apart from that, the sustainable dyeing is an area which is gaining momentum. So where, these are just things that are really at a nascent stage and under trial for us. So exploring, for example, recycled dyes, so dyes from post and pre-consumer waste, can we extract that and make new dyes out of that, or dyes from microbes, so extracting the natural colors from microbes? That's another example that's under trial. And recently we became the first woven supplier in India to create a cradle to cradle gold certified product. That's a pretty advanced certification, but basically what that means is this product that we've made is 100% recyclable, carbon neutral, and 100% made with organic cotton. Another area where we're working in, where we're seeing momentum, is onshore manufacturing. So in the beginning, Charanya highlighted that a big problem is mass production, high inventories. So a model that we're exploring with some other suppliers and brands is a small batch custom manufacturing model where the manufacturing is actually happening closer to where consumers are as of now, so Europe and US. Another project which I'll talk, I guess, more about later is this project which we're doing with the Hong Kong Research Institute of Textile and Apparel, where we are looking at how cotton residue from separating cotton poly blends can be used to grow new cotton more effectively. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing. And what I've noticed in these, partnerships and also in general from my research that I've done is that the most successful kind of pilots or technologies are the ones where both parties are invested, whether that's financially or investing any other kind of resources. There's a shared vision, joint commitment, and usually where there's business incentive for a supplier to kind of do this because it's high risk, high cost. That's why we were so successful with Cradle to Cradle, because the brand partner CNA was totally invested in the project financially, sharing technical advice, and now there's a huge demand for this product also, so it made business sense for us to undertake this process.
Yeah, thanks for laying out the landscape so well. And I love the point from your dissertation, because we do know that there is this power dynamic between brands and suppliers. And so really understanding how that can be solved for and how both parties can basically commit more financially also, and how it can kind of increase incentives for both is crucial. You also spoke about materials like viscose and using fabric scraps. So I want to come to Karan after that. Karan, can you share information about 2-3 innovations in the material space that you're seeing, and are any of these tech enabled?
So I have to say that I don't think there's just 2 or 3. I think there's quite a few really good innovations and technologies in the space of materials. And as at Laudes, what we are sort of looking to do is to actually support these innovations through pre-competitive collaborations, like both Gauri and Priyanka mentioned, the pilots that they're running with FFG brand partners. So we're a founding partner to Fashion for Good, and what we do with them is also around sort of identifying these innovations, and Priyanka's laid out quite a great list there. And then we work with brand partners and manufacturers and these innovators to enable them to actually test and scale. So right now, for instance, we're supporting some of Fashion for Good's foundational projects around chemically recycled textiles, which is also where Shahi is participating, right? Which is around the use of chemically recycled, textile waste to create new fibers, with 5 different innovators that have different kinds of technologies that are promising and, producing different kinds of output. Mainly from cotton waste at this point. We're also supporting another project around renewable carbon, which is this whole new amazing space of materials that's coming from agri-waste that's really trying to replace fossil fuels in the material mix altogether by using something called PHA-based fibers. I don't have sort of the greatest technical expertise here, but I'm sure we'll cover that at some point. And so we're also supporting a lot of these kinds of projects where there's innovations that are focused on using waste, using newer kinds of feedstocks. So I don't think I could say there's 2 or 3. I'd say it's more the category of innovations that are promising. And, we'll probably cover some of their names later, but of course, the links I'll share of the FFG projects where you'll be able to find some of their names of the ones that are participating in these.
Great, thanks for that. And I want to come back to natural dyeing and materials. That's also something Charanya highlighted. That's a highly chemical intensive process. So Dr. Deepti, are natural dyes a viable alternative to chemical dyeing for natural and synthetic fibers? And how can we reduce effects in the dyeing process?
Yeah, so before I answer that question, I thought I'll just briefly mention the kind of projects that we have been working on at IIT for the past almost 30 years now. So one of the first projects which you mentioned about was natural dyes. And we were almost the first people to look at them from a scientific point of view. Natural dyes had been the domain of craftspeople. So whatever was published and was available in public domain was by craftsmen, and there wasn't much scientific or technological input available on their structures and their properties and how to dye the fibers, etc. So those are some of the things that we looked at. And very interestingly, what we found once we had established the mechanism and looked at, purified the dyes and looked at their structure, etc., we found that they just don't, not only are dyes, but very interestingly, because most of them are sourced from these so-called herbs, they also have medicinal properties. So for the first time, we went ahead and actually looked and tried to see natural dye plus what other than dye they could do. And we actually carried out tests on antimicrobial properties and found that quite a few of them actually have very strong antimicrobial properties. So this is what we mean by multifunctional finish, where you are actually dyeing the fabric, but at the same time, the fabric is also acquiring antimicrobial. So of course, now because of the pandemic, we all know about antibacterial properties and textiles, etc. So natural dyes have those properties also. They have anti-UV properties also. That is, they protect you from, UPF, etc. They say SPF, what they talk about in cosmetics. We say UPF, ultraviolet protection factor. So these dyes actually also protect you from this. They also, some of them may have anti-aging properties also. So that's the kind of work that we did. We looked at, not just the dyeing properties, but also these other properties. And that's what we said, they have multifunctional properties. The second area extending this work we worked on was looked at other natural materials, which are also, waste products. So one of the materials, some of you might have heard about it, is called chitosan, a very strong polycationic molecule, which is obtained from the, these waste shells, crustaceans. So wherever there is this fishery, the canning and in Kerala, etc., where they have these food processing industry, these shells are thrown away of the fish, and this compound is extracted. This again is one of the most powerful antimicrobial compounds known. So we looked at the technology of applying this polymer to textiles as a substitute for, other more synthetic, which are currently used and which are mostly insecticides, as a substitute for synthetic antimicrobial agents. So that was another thing. Third material that we looked at is called as sericin. This is a material which is a waste byproduct of the silk processing industry. So whenever you process silk, first you wash the raw yarn, and this, because this is also called as silk gum, it gets washed off. And that's when silk acquires its luster, etc. This adds to the TDS in the effluent streams. So when people started examining this molecule, again, we find this is a very strong biomolecule with antioxidant properties and anti-aging and wound healing properties, etc. So that's another project where we are working for a company currently, where we are trying to develop t-shirts and jeans with this sericin based finish. So it's not just a finish, but it will also give you healing properties and moisture transport and things like that. So these are three projects that we worked on in this area. And the fourth, which currently we are working on, is looking at these agro bio wastes because of this crop waste burning, the kind of so for example, government has been saying that we need to find value added uses for these products. So we are looking at millets, bajra, a coarse grain, and from its straw we have extracted cellulose, characterized it, and we are using it as an adsorbent for extracting dyes from the effluent. So it's doing two purposes. It is looking at a waste product, creating an industrial material out of it, and using it as a substitute for synthetic materials, which are generally used in effluent plants. So these are some of the things that we are working on currently. And coming back to, if I have time, I would like to answer your question, was regarding sustainability of natural dyes. Well, the definition of sustainability is very, very wide. Natural dyes need a completely new ecosystem. If you just try to bring in a natural dye into the existing synthetic dye ecosystem, it's not going to work. It's not viable. It's not acceptable. I can tell you in last 30 years, 7 to 8 people have tried to set up plants and failed. So ultimately, it's the economics which drives the whole chain, whatever one may say. And unless we set in an ecosystem where it is marketed in a certain way, where it is produced in a certain way, where it is used in a certain way, without going into the details, it's not, as of, if you were to ask me, it's not viable unless you're really willing to invest big time in natural dyes. Yeah.
And just a quick follow-up. Thanks for that, by the way, super useful information. What about natural materials? Do you think they're commercially viable?
Yes, of course, quite a few of them are. But how you use them, how you market them, natural dyes materials में major problem is the issue of supply. We've developed the technology, but to get a consistent supply of the same type of material, the variation in natural material is so much that somewhere you have to process it to standardize it. And to have a continuous supply, this has been an issue with natural dyes because they are seasonal. It's not always possible to get the same quality or same consistency. And this is the problem we are facing with Cetirizine also, for example. Every time to get the same kind of quality and consistent supply is a big challenge. So before we can think about, large scale or upscaling them, not upscaling, but commercializing them at large scale, the entire supply chain has to be taken care of. And I think some of the organizations which are represented here need to look at those aspects. So it's a very long process. But yes, once that is done, it's viable.
Yeah, definitely. Those are extremely pertinent points. And since we're on commercial viability, I do want to touch upon tech adaptation, especially for the Indian context. So we do know that digital penetration in India is nowhere near complete. In fact, garment workers, often who are the bulk of the fashion industry, don't always own smartphones, don't always have easy access to the internet. And this is a question open to all panelists. How can we adapt circular solutions to this context, which are tech enabled?
So I just want to step in here also to maybe talk about what Dr. Deepti was saying earlier, right? I think the road to sort of commercialization is supremely important when it comes to natural materials and other things. And no matter what technology you're using, you have to have that supply chain in place to be able to feed into it, right? Whether it's one of these chemical recycling technologies or some sort of, digitally enabled infrastructure. And that's what we're also trying to do. So when we sort of commissioned research on the agri-waste as a feedstock for textile fibers last year, one of the biggest challenges was also to look at, of course, through sort of Fashion for Good, Canopy, and others, we know that there are innovations, and Dr. Deepti said this as well, that there are so many technologies, but the feedstock for them, their supply, the sort of logistics around them, the costs of actually being able to commercialize them, these are all big questions that still needed to be answered, right? And I think there's a role to play for foundations like ours, which are really sort of allies of business, to be able to help fill in those gaps and accelerate the transition. But when it comes to sort of adoption of digital technologies and things like that, I think it still rests, of course, with the brands and the manufacturers, right? Like we are sort of building the system, but then someone needs to also be in the system. And yeah, maybe not to put a spotlight, but maybe Gauri, you have a point there. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to digress too much from what Lavanya was asking, but yeah, I do agree with you, Karan, because again, just going back to what I found in my research, which you and Priyanka also kind of informed, the reason why some of these technologies, although they're doing really well, but they're not scaling, is because there's a lot of friction currently between brands and suppliers. There's existing tensions between their relationship, whether it's the fact that it's a highly price sensitive industry. There's huge pricing pressures on suppliers. So on the one hand, they're being asked to innovate, and on the other hand, the sourcing teams are putting pricing pressure. There's no kind of long-term commitment from brands in terms of, if you invest in this technology as a supplier, we'll continue to source this much volume from you for these many years. So because of a lot of these challenges, sometimes these technologies are not able to get implemented. And what my research kind of found was that unless we fix some of these fundamental issues between brands and suppliers, where brands want suppliers to be more proactive, suppliers want brands to be more committed, we may not be able to see high levels of collaboration. But yeah, coming back to your question, Lavanya, about the social aspect of this. Actually, this is a project Laudes Foundation has funded, I think, keeping workers in the loop with BSR. And they're trying to explore through their research what would be a just transition for circularity. So what would be the jobs impact of trends like automation and climate change, and how do we account for those impacts when we're making decisions towards transitioning to circularity. So Shahi is a partner for this project, and we're really looking forward to the insights that come from this, because there is a huge gap in this. Even when I was doing my literature review, there was a huge gap on the social impact of circularity, and it's really nice to see research like this coming out. And around, I think, end of this year, we would have some practical insights and policy recommendations for the industry to implement as well.
Yeah, not to put you too much on the spot, Karan, but do you want to talk more about what motivated that research? Any initial insights?
So I'm not sure if there's any initial insights at this point, but I will be able to let you know once the sort of draft is out and ready. I think for us specifically, it was also around at that point, we were looking at circular fashion and the circular economy in fashion. And a big part of the conversation was, of course, around the environment and all of this. But one thing, of course, as Laudes, we're sort of a foundation that's looking at both the climate sort of crisis as well as inequality. And that's really what motivated us to also, continue that work around bridging the gap, as we call it, of like finding how the social sort of aspects of a circular economy, will play out over time. What are the sort of social impacts of circular business models across these industries? And what does that mean for different stakeholders? And I think at this point, we will wait for the report obviously to come out, but it's been good to see at least the kind of engagement from different industry players, brands, manufacturers, recyclers, garment workers, to actually see what their views are as well. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation that does need to happen and come out. Are we being inclusive in the way that we're rolling out these technologies as well? Hopefully we are, but only time will tell.
Yeah, Priyanka, do you want to add anything?
I feel like there are two conversations going on. One was around the social side, and the other was around the challenges of large-scale adoption of technology. I think on the social sustainability side, I think we have a role to play, but it's still smaller because we are much more focused on the technology end. But having said that, we also understand it's one of the biggest dilemma in the whole slowing down of fast fashion actually directly affects the industry. And the current economic model of the industry is low cost, high volume. And that low cost literally translates into really, really marginal cost for every garment produced by a worker. And then the millions of people who are dependent on this industry are actually gaining that marginal cost per item. So I don't know if there is a real solution to this, but like Karan said, for every initiative we take now, we need to keep this in mind as like one of the criteria going forward. But in an ideal world, or in, let's say, in a complete hypothetical space, it would look like the industry would look in a way where brands would produce less but charge more, and where these workers would actually produce much lesser number of garments but gain a lot more per garment. And in an ideal situation, all of that pushes us towards really high quality, because now we're doing lesser number of garments, which means consumers are buying less and they want higher quality garments that stay with them. But it's such an idealistic and hypothetical situation right now. And I don't necessarily see a direct part to it, but I think all of our individual efforts on technologies, adoption, on initiatives of the government, et cetera, sort of working towards that. And ideally should be working towards it. Whether it's fast enough or not, we don't know that yet. So I'm a little conflicted. I don't have a very positive view of how quickly we are making that happen. On the other end, I do want to pitch in, because that is on the challenges of adoption of these technologies and scaling of these technologies. I think that's pretty much, that summarizes the role Fashion for Good plays, right? Because we are looking at scaling up, identifying the right technologies for the industry, and then scaling them up in the industry. So we have a little bit of now background on what different type of challenges exist, particularly challenges across different types of technology areas that exist in all of the supply chain. And if I was to summarize a few, I think a lot of them got already picked up here. Financing is definitely a key challenge. As Karan said, there are organizations like Laudes, but also investment by the brands and other means of financing this transition that is required. That's definitely a key challenge. Prior to that, the key challenge is actually identifying the right technologies too and helping them develop. And what happens with technologies, any kind of technology is an ongoing, it's a growing process. It's not like today I've developed a technology. The technology needs to be improved over time to reach the quality level that the industry can work with. And I think that itself is a process. The reason sometimes industry doesn't move as quickly also because the technologies are still taking time to process. And some of the ways of actually helping them scale is actually to test, to pilot, to give enough feedback with these mechanisms to see where this technology potentially fits in. And that sort of works in all types of technologies that exist. To have this testing and piloting, that is where the third challenge comes in, which is on industry offtake. So as Lavanya mentioned earlier also, that this is not necessarily an equal industry. There's a lot of power that stays with the brands, and then there are manufacturers who play more of a reactive role, and then the rest is supply chain. Brands do need to push for offtake quite a lot, which means that there has to be a top-down push. And sometimes they only do it because there is governmental push. So the challenge then becomes, there is a policy push that potentially drives a brand, and then there's the industry push that drives the rest of the supply chain to adopt these technologies. So that an overall offtake coming from brands in tandem, in partnership with manufacturers, is sort of another key challenge, because the way the industry is set up currently, or for the last few years, that a brand doesn't work with one manufacturer, they work with hundreds of manufacturers. So they will have a few key manufacturers. For example, Shahi plays a really key role for many, many brands, but most manufacturers don't have that position, which means no negotiation power to actually push back and say, we want to adopt technologies. So that balance of power definitely becomes a key challenge in not enough people adopting these technologies. And I would say last and also very key role would be on the policy side. I've sort of summarized it into 4 key challenges that we see, but I think it can be further broken down into many, many challenges. But last bit, on the policy side, we're seeing movement happening in Europe, for example, in the West a lot more. There are policies starting to come through. But while we research policy landscape in countries like India or other manufacturing and developing nations, it's still quite behind. It's still playing a very reactive role. And part of that reason is of not having enough knowledge or knowing about technologies that exist or potential new opportunities that exist for the industry. So sorry, I made that a long answer, but I'll summarize it here.
That's super useful. In fact, I was planning on asking you the policy aspect of this, and you already touched upon this. Just a quick follow-up. What role do you think consumers can play in all of this?
This is another dilemma for myself personally, because I know consumers technically are the end of the supply chain, which means they are the final users of this product and they play a huge role. And a change in behavior from the consumer side and an actual change in the way people buy will make a huge difference to the whole supply chain. In the current situation, it feels less and less because there is the industries are structured in a fast fashion format. Consumers aren't really changing behavior fast enough. And it's still, these decisions still lie around with the industry and policymakers. But if consumers were to become much more aware, were to change their behaviors towards buying more circular, buying less, but buying secondhand, buying rentals, that should massively impact any manufacturer, any brand for them to push them to finally take a decision. But each of us can play a role, but collectively we can actually make a difference. So I think the challenge on the consumer side is really, if we have the mass, then it makes a difference. Current sustainable consumption community is still smaller in everywhere. So it's still smaller movements, and brands are actually very quickly reacting, maybe not very quickly, but are reacting to this change in consumer mindsets. You'll see brands across the West, for example, have started taking back their stuff and looking at a secondhand model. Patagonia has had that for a long time. There are quite a few other brands who are now saying, how do we have a resale of our own materials on our website itself? But we still need consumers to step up more and say, this is exactly what we want, and we will potentially consume less.
Yeah, and I think that personal dilemma exists for everyone who's working also in this industry. Cool. Sanya and Tanvi are messaging me that I have like 3 more minutes. So last question to Gauri. On the research side, you did mention the HK Rita project. So can you just talk a bit more about, I'm going to club a bunch of questions. What motivated Shahi to take this up? What actually happened? What are your findings? And how are you planning to scale it up?
Whoa. Okay. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I think Shahi and HK Rita had been in conversation. HK Rita, by the way, is Hong Kong Research Institute of Textile and Apparel, and they do research on, technologies that can be applied in fashion and related industries. And we've been in conversation for a long time, exploring some of the technologies and research they're doing and seeing if there's opportunity for Shahi to support their research or apply some of it. And this is, I think, a really good example of how something from like a lab research can be brought to a field research and testing stage when a manufacturer takes that leadership and says, okay, we're going to partner together and try something out. The way we approach this project is we found that there's like 2 broad challenges, but unrelated challenges, right? On the one hand, we have in India a large proportion of smallholder farmers, cotton farmers who rely on rain-fed farming and often face, extreme water stress, drought situations, which leads to low yield, low productivity, loss of income. On the other side, we see huge amounts of textile waste. We've talked about that a lot, so I do need to emphasize that, which is either getting landfilled, but basically it's not coming back into the fashion system. So HK Rita actually came up with this technology, which is able to separate blended textiles, polyester and cotton, through a hydrothermal process. So through this process, using heat, water, and green chemicals, they're able to separate these blends. Polyester is almost entirely turned into yarn. And the cotton residue is something they experimented with, and they were wondering, how can we use this cotton residue? And they came up with something called a super absorbent polymer. SAPs do exist. I mean, we have petrochemical-based SAPs in, for example, sanitary napkins. But this is like a cellulose-based SAP now made from cotton residue. And in their lab testing, they actually found that if you apply this SAP in production of cotton, it's actually improving yield of cotton. So then that's when Shahi and HK Rita partnered to use this in a field experiment. So we actually did a small experiment last year where we applied this SAP in the soil. We grew cotton in different conditions. So in highly advanced irrigation system, under rain-fed farming with water stress conditions, we mimicked what water stress would look like. And interestingly, we found across the board, SAP is improving cotton yield, especially in the water stress condition. It's actually increasing yield by 25%. So this comes back to the challenges, right? So it is kind of solving the textile waste problem to an extent. It could potentially support cotton farmers, improve their yield, and it's eco-friendly. It's not a petrochemical-based item with cellulose. It could biodegrade. And we were so, impressed by these results that right now we're actually doing a larger experiment with the Agricultural University of Dharwad, where we are now testing. We're going into details. So we're trying different quantities of SAP, different quantities of water. It's a highly technical scientific experiment. I won't get into the details, but the goal is to be able to come up with a process and application of SAP. And eventually we could imagine scaling this up to farmers, finding a way to kind of make it commercially viable, giving accessibility to other people to use it. And right now, HK Data is finding a way to produce SAP at industrial scale. It's currently at lab scale. So we could imagine a future where maybe our waste is being converted to SAP as well. So right now, our focus is on the second experiment, but going forward, we would be exploring all these questions as to how do we scale this up? How do we get this in the hands of farmers? How do we make it commercially viable? And how do we produce it at industrial scale, maybe using our own waste?
Yeah, that's super useful. And I actually have a few more minutes. So this is actually my last question for Dr. Deepti. Can you talk a bit more about what kind of support you think, because there's been a lot of conversation around what is commercially viable, what can be scaled up. So in your experience, what kind of support is needed to scale commercially in India from government and industry both?
So actually, we find that textile industry in particular has always shied away from investing in research and development. Compared to how it works in the developed world, where a lot of research gets done in a consortia format, where a lot of companies and government and academia come together to carry out research, which is then translated or taken forward by the industry. We do not find the same kind of support coming from the industry in India. It's not like we do not work. And as far as our natural dyes work is concerned, we did work with a company. The company took it up big time, set up a complete plant, set up a complete, they were producing a complete range of home linen, which was being retailed in big stores in US, completely natural dyed range, So it was a success for a very long time. But as soon as the US orders dried up, the company kind of had to shut down, because there wasn't a market in India. I can also tell you that it was not just that there wasn't a market in India. When they first started exporting, this buyer actually created a whole ecosystem, and the kind of investments that were made in marketing the product and creating a hype about this product being natural dyed, etc., is something we need. So I'll tell you a comparable scenario in India, for example. I have been to exhibitions where they say natural dyed products. I'm sure all of you have been there. And so there is this sari, which is routine or synthetic dyed, and there is this sari, which is natural dyed. They look exactly the same, but they charge me 1.5 times for the natural dyed product, while it looks the same. Even though they had used our technology to develop the product, was not willing to pay that additional premium. What I'm saying is you have to develop new products. You have to, sell these products in a separate this thing. You have to create a new market, and that we found is, that kind of investment that has to happen is not there all the time in general in the apparel, textile and apparel sector. So that has been a huge constraint. And unless that happens, academia can only do as much. We can only do research, but it actually has to, if it has to be translated, then the industry has to come forward and invest not just money, but time, resources, and manpower most importantly, who will translate these processes into their existing systems. So that is a big gap there, is what I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to add one point to what Dr. Deepti said. Even with our HK data trial, the reason we were able to undertake that is because we have an agricultural department. We have experts in this area, and not everybody has that or would be willing to, invest that kind of time into, just research that could go, either way. It takes patience and it also takes, commitment to invest.
I think this is something that we struggle with the most, because we identify, especially in countries like India, most of the technology actually, the newer ones, the more exciting ones, which have a huge potential, actually are still at university stage. And the big challenge becomes is how do you bridge this gap? Because industry wants it, the university has it, but there are still steps in the middle. We literally need entrepreneurs who pick up this technology, have some marketing, business development skills, and work with the industry closely. And the adoption doesn't usually go like, we've taken this and we've applied this. It's actually a work in progress, because there has to be constant industry feedback. There has to be improvement upon those technology to work better with the machineries. For example, a particular kind of dye cannot work in a particular kind of machinery. And does that mean that improvement has to happen, that manufacturers need to buy something new, or there is a to and fro R&D process that needs to happen jointly? So I think that is probably a huge gap identified, particularly in an Indian market.
Yeah, because you see, the academia can never really give you a technology which is ready to be used on the shop floor. Like you very rightly said, there are a few steps. So industry is here and we are here, and somewhere, 2-3 steps have to be taken by both, like Gauri said rightly. When that happens, everything is possible.
Yeah, and I just want to say that that's really where this idea of free competitive collaboration really comes in, right? You need multiple brands, manufacturers, and innovators working together, and well, that's really what we at Laudes also support. But I think it's also important to highlight that as we develop or refine these technologies, we're not losing sight of the fact that we don't want to repeat history in some sense, right? We want to be able to mitigate the unintended consequences of, developing new technologies that may or may not have harmful consequences. And being mindful of that as we develop them is another really big important part that, we often tend to forget, but is very important as well.
Great. So we'll get into audience Q&A now. There are quite a lot. So let's see how many we can get through in the next half an hour. Nitish is saying, on one hand, brands are promoting sustainability and circular fashion. The fashion consumers, on the other hand, are still inclined towards fast fashion. Shein is an example because it surpassed H&M, Zara, and others in the US to become the largest fashion brand. Why is that the case, and why is circularity still a marketing gimmick?
I think I can start with my views on this one, since we work most closely with brands. I think this is where I see the lack of policy plays a huge role. When you see brands who are, for example, based out of EU or certain areas where policy is starting to push them towards making circularity targets, they don't have an option. They have to work towards adopting technologies. They're not necessarily, I don't think anyone's moved away from the core business model, the way they sell right now, because no one's saying we'll give up revenue tomorrow. But that exploration of how better materials can be added on, if the policy says at least 20% recycled is considered recycled, then at least let us start indulging in that. And then slowly they're able to increase this. While in certain areas and regions, none of the brands don't have any push. They don't have any accountability on the environmental side yet. And that's why I think it's not necessary in their interest to actually push for this right now. However, once the regulatory umbrella comes forward, and then there are things that they have to adhere to, they will be able to move to this much quickly. And normally, it's not, I would still say, a marketing gimmick. It's to encourage more sustainability in the industry. Right now, there are policies that say, even if you have 10% of recycled material, you can promote it or market it as recycled. And that becomes an incentive for anyone to engage into that 10% recycle also. Ideally, yes, you would say only 100% recycle should be considered recycle or marketed as recycled, for example. This is just citing one example. But there are no mechanism or no technology is developed enough to build that much just yet for brands to adopt. And that technology development adoption curve will take its time also. So it's not necessarily a marketing gimmick. It's what is available in the market is being used by the brands now and pushing forward as here is what we are doing. We are accepting these rules and showing, let's say 20%, 30% and calling it recycle still. So I believe that will change. I think the other challenge, the bigger challenge is that the areas that don't have the policy where brands are not necessarily adhering to anything, that is important. Because the self-regulation, while it still sounds like a great consumer story, not necessarily every brand has model that's fit for self-regulation, where they'll say, now we want to go towards sustainability because we believe in this. I think it's mostly coming from a governmental push. I will stop here.
Yeah, that's extremely well articulated. Do any of the other panelists want to respond to this question?
I think Priyanka said it all.
Okay, fine. I can move to the next one. So there are two for Dr. Deepti that I'm going to combine. Padmini is asking if there are any papers on the natural dye healing benefits that you mentioned. And Anab Savan, I hope I got that pronunciation right. Is there any authenticated test reports / methods established we can offer to the international buyer on the natural dyed fabric or natural dye stuff printed fabric?
So yeah, there are papers. We've published quite a few papers where we've established the antimicrobial properties. So maybe I can share it with, I have contacts of Bharti. I can share those papers and they can be shared with you. Yes, so that's been established. And the second question is very interesting. As a matter of fact, that is one issue that we faced all along when the companies came forward and adopted natural dyes. This issue of authentication, whether it is actually truly natural dyed or not, because at its peak in the early 90s, I can tell you there were much more materials that were being sold or claimed to be natural dyes as were much more than what was being produced. So yes, technically, scientifically, there are very simple methods. Spectroscopic, optical methods are there. If you have a library of the spectra of these dyes, you can do that. The only issue is that none of these methods is non-destructive. And none of these methods can be carried out at the point of sale. So while if you bring it to the lab, some labs will be able to tell you that this is indeed this dye or is it natural or not. Yes, it's possible. But it's not possible for a customer to find out at the point of sale whether it is so. So yes, certification can be given. It can be established, but not by a customer at the point of sale.
Thank you for that. Garvit is asking, we as a brand and fashion label can work on multiple factors, but majority of the customers are not into sustainable practice and it is very difficult to sell products. This is related to the question that Priyanka already answered, but slightly different because they're asking how can we make this more acceptable and accessible to consumers.
I think that's going back to the consumer awareness point that you spoke about earlier. We know that more and more consumers are becoming more conscious, but it's still not the mass scale. And which is why currently building strategies around just consumer adoption, it is particularly the reason why brands are not increasing prices. because consumers might not have enough appetite to buy this just yet. And I think this comes with more awareness. So conversations like these, which are driving more awareness about circularity, more B2C conversations. Now universities pulling out circular economy courses and teaching students about this. I think that is changing the mindset quite a lot and creating awareness. And it is a longer term game though. So I think it is still something that you have to push for, but not expect results immediately. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for this.
Yeah, I can add something. I mean, I don't run a brand myself, and I don't have that much experience with consumer facing work, but something that Lavanya and I have discovered through our work at SAS, we run master classes with brands like Doodlage who are, running these sustainable fashion brands. And a lot of what they kind of share through their journey is that selling sustainability only works till a certain point for them. After a point, it's more about the design, the aesthetic, the brand values, the price. And it's really hard to attract customers just on the basis of sustainability. That's not their top priority. And you kind of have to, build that in your business. As hard as that is, we know how hard it is to, run a brand that is sustainable, but then build out all these other attributes of your business, whether, like I said, it's design or the price or the values or how you communicate with your customer, your packaging, your touch points with the customer. So yeah, that's just been my insight from running some of these sessions, that sustainability marketing has its limitations, and that's been proven, that exists in research as well.
Yeah, I also want to add that I think, with our experience of working with a lot of these projects that are, again, more sort of on the business side rather than the consumer side, I think one thing is everybody's looking to find ways to ensure that sustainable products or garments or materials, whatever they are, match up to conventional garments, in the sense that you shouldn't have to differentiate them so much, right? Because the moment you start differentiating them, that's when you add a different sort of opinion to your consumers and how they're sort of purchasing things. But I think it's very important to recognize that consumers play an important role, like Priyanka mentioned, but the brands and the manufacturers also play an equally important role in being able to scale these solutions and innovations and technologies. Because without scale, you're not going to be able to get to the level of sort of comparison that you need. There's currently 60 million plus tons of polyester fiber that's made from fossil fuels in the industry today. If you're going to even match that up against sort of a sustainable alternative, we as an industry need to really, really invest much more in the supply chain. And consumers will take what they see, right? But the brands have the choice of what to put out, and so do the manufacturers and all of us. And I think it's really a collaborative effort that's required.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, just a final thought that comes to mind. I mean, we are also all consumers. So I was thinking about from my perspective, and as someone who's hyper aware, I'm still not making the best choices all the time. And the reason behind that is, like Karan said, accessibility and scale. Like some of the brands that I love and follow, sometimes they don't have what I'm looking for. Like, it's just sustainable fashion isn't that accessible right now, whether it's price or it's quantity or it's design. I think it'll take some time from both the consumer side and the brand side to reach that scale and accessibility.
If I add there, just going beyond access also, it's also our consumer behavior. We've known about sustainability amongst us as a group of aware consumers only in less than a decade, right? Less than a decade of working in sustainability and knowing about sustainability in the fashion industry. Our behavior, which has been a pattern for decades, has been around buying the way we have been buying. So breaking that pattern still takes time. So even if you look at, there might be a million aware consumers, the ones actually buying completely sustainable and actually looking at all the meeting all the right tick of sustainable consumers is less than 10% of that, because the behavior pattern changes over a period of time. It doesn't start with year one, it will happen over 2 to 3 years of awareness. And that user journey makes it harder for brands and manufacturers. As for example, Garvit said, he's a fashion label, it makes it harder for fashion labels, which is why, as Gauri said earlier, sustainability is a core of what you're selling, yes, but that's your core belief. It's not necessarily your consumer will only buy into sustainability, they'll also buy into your product and your connection to the brand story generally.
Cool. So we have a few more minutes. I'm gonna ask a question that Jacob submitted. They submitted a bunch, but I think a lot of those have been covered. But one kind of running theme in their question is it viable for technology to be an open source, to be in Creative Commons?
I just want to step in here and say I think it is. And we at Laudes are actually working with Canopy to look at open source models of collaborative innovation globally to see if there's examples. Can they be translated to the fashion industry? How can we all learn from each other? Like all of us have said before, how can we collaborate to do this R&D better? And does it become a question of like patents, IP, all of that? Is I think something we all need to look and reconsider as an industry, because I think really open source is probably the way to go, and it's how nature works, it's how we should work, and that's what we are also trying to find out, if it does work.
I feel like that is then ideal. I was smiling because I thought, Karan, you should take this one. But I have a point of view, because if everything was open source, it actually questions all the business models that the world has currently. It's almost saying if the first Pfizer vaccine, if it was open source, the whole world would have been vaccinated because everyone would have created that. It wouldn't have taken this long. And sadly, the way businesses have been built, our current economic system actually goes beyond open source. Every technology needs to be protected. And currently, when we talk to our technologies, we also support them in that process. And I'm not sure if there is a path, and hopefully with Laudes project, we will know more, but I don't see a clear-cut path from these innovators who build something and want to protect to reaching that open source where everyone in the world knows what these technologies are. So I think this would be one of the most interesting spaces to watch out for if we're able to achieve it in the next, if you actually can find a path to achieve it at some point.
Cool. Okay,
Sorry, I just wanted to also ask, I mean, I feel like Dr. Deepti also might have a view here that I'd love to hear from the actual sort of technology development and research perspective. Yeah.
I deliberately did not want to comment on that because, no, I don't think it's possible. Like Priyanka rightly said, this is not how business models. We are not a business, but we are in a business of R&D, if you would, and patenting and protecting is something that needs to be done, and yet it's completely possible. Because most of our research is funded by someone, right? So the first right remains with whoever funds. So while as scientists, we may not be very particular, we are open to sharing, but whoever funds has the first right to rejection, we say it. And companies, if they do come forward, it may not be fair, to put things in the open source or open domain from the outset itself. So this is not how the world works. So but as academics, what we do and what we prefer is to publish. So we are extensively publish our results, so which is all in the open domain. So we do both, but if it is sponsored by the industry, then it is restricted. But most of our research otherwise is in the open domain. Like I said, all our papers, everything that we've done is out there.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you can answer the next question also, not to put you too much on the spot, but because you were talking about the role that governments can play. So Sai Siddharth is asking, what advice would you have for policymakers when and if they're designing any kinds of these interventions?
What advice would we have for policymakers? Policymakers, you mean the government? Or
Yes,
I don't see much policy happening in our country to talk about. You know, there's not a very this thing. So I really don't know. I think one has to have a general atmosphere of trust. I think this is something that is lacking, you know, between business, government, and academia. You know, that trust has to build up that, okay, we'll be able to do it together, and whatever policy may be, and define. So if you want to say sustainable fashion, then it has to be defined at the top level as to what the policy has to be. And then everybody has to fall in place. Legislation plays a very important role, as has been said earlier. Unless there is that push, you know, most development doesn't happen. So that kind of targeted, you know, one step at a time kind of policy, if we could have very clearly defined that, okay, this is banned, you cannot use this particular chemical. You know, things in processing, if I was to say, things which have been banned for a long time continue to be used in the industry. So all chlorine-based, phosphorus-based chemicals have been banned. There are substitutes available, but there is no legislation to control those. So we keep hearing about plants being shut down, and textile industry, particularly in many areas. You know, entire Tirupur was shut down, if you would know, the knitwear cluster, because of pollution. Many units in Rajasthan, Jaipur were shut down. But then, you know, there is no clear-cut policy. This happens in spurts, and there is no clarity on what can be done and what cannot be done. So at the policy level, that clarity is very important, I think, and implementation of the same.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we're close to time, so I'm going to take the last audience question, which any of you can respond to. Mamta is asking that there is a need for sustainable and circular indices that businesses can refer to. So are there any such avenues?
Can you repeat that?
Certifications? I don't think I'm clear on the question. Do you mean
They're
like
asking? Yeah, I think they're asking about any indices that businesses can use to measure their sustainability and circularity efforts.
So I can share one index that we use, and it's widely adopted in the industry. It's the HIG index, created by Sustainable Apparel Coalition. It's a standard measure to kind of measure your environmental performance. We also have a social module, which is called FSLM. I know you didn't ask about social, but they also have that. That's something that we, you know, use at Shahi, and it's widely used in the industry right now.
And a lot of standards are there. A lot of standards are there, which eco standards. So there are many standards which the companies use, you know, whether it is GOTS or Ecotex. So very often people get their material tested, and these companies give these certification. So quite a few are there.
If I may just add, in terms of standards like this, I think Higgs Index is what most of the industry is using right now, because it's quite overall. And it's measurement for all parts of the supply chain. And then the standards, it depends, like it's very easily searchable. If you're a manufacturer or brand, you can actually just Google what are the right standards for you. But I think organizations like Textile Exchange probably have a list of on their sites as well. Where if you're looking at particularly cotton related, if it is other recycled material related, there's probably a landscape of 50 to 100 already standards. And while the industry matures in this area, there are newer ones that are coming all the time as well. So whether it's the Blue Jeans certification, GOTS, it will completely depend on what your product is and what you are looking for particularly, and very easily searchable online.
Yeah, but I also want to just maybe add that even with, like, I saw circulatics in the chat and the Hague Index, I think there's a need to also realize that these are all things that are still being built up by the industry. These are all entirely new concepts and ideas, and you I think there's a lot of scope for improvement, and everybody recognizes that. But it's a good place to start to also remember that we shouldn't be making more of these indices, but strengthening the ones that exist, right? And sort of the Hague is trying to do that. I know there's a lot of other sort of efforts around the product environmental footprint in the EU, and India as well is sort of industry is picking up, but I don't think there's sort of a sort of government regulation in India from this angle. And I also want to sort of highlight that a lot of things like the Hague are also voluntary, right? And that's where also policy probably plays an important role in making things mandatory for the industry to also do.
Cool. Any other remarks from any of you? We're through with the audience Q&A. So yeah, any closing reflections, or I'll hand it over to Bharti.
I mean, just this discussion has, I've realized that there's so many aspects to circularity, and it could be, extremely confusing for someone who's attending and just trying to get into this space. It could be really overwhelming. But I think, yeah, I just feel like if you feel overwhelmed or if you feel like this is like too much, it's okay. Just like, I feel like just continue exploring, reading, talking to people, and there are great solutions, but there are also still lots of problems and challenges for us to solve. Like Karan mentioned, we have the Hague Index, but we need to strengthen it.
I think that would be my parting thought as well. Especially when you get deeper into this conversation, it feels like when you're at a superficial level and you're just starting to dig, then it's very exciting because there are technologies, there are all this work projects that are happening. When you dig deeper, you feel like there's so many challenges and it can feel very negative. But challenges aside, I think there's a great community working in sustainability and circularity in the fashion industry already. We're all trying to solve these problems, and I think we're all quite positive that we will get somewhere. So it's always good to remember. I was reading some of the questions and I felt like maybe we made the conversation too sad and negative. So maybe it's always good to remember that we are working towards it. Lots of people are working towards it, and we're going to find solutions soon.
Yeah. And yeah, on a sort of similar note, I think one thing I want to share with everyone, like what Gauri said, it can be overwhelming, right? Circularity is sort of opening the doors of the industry to also so many other things like waste value chains, food, fashion, fiber, forest, fuel, and sort of looking at how all of these dots connect can sort of create this beautiful, very, very blurry picture. But I think it's very important that we start somewhere. And there's courses, there's things that the industry is doing. As consumers, there's a lot of information available to sort of educate yourself. But I think one thing to always remember, and I think this conversation really highlighted it for me, is that we all need to work together if anything is going to happen. And without sort of collaborative efforts to do any of this, we're not going to get anywhere.
Dr. Deepti, anything from you, or all yours?
No, I'm good. I think collaboration is very important, and we have to make a beginning, like it was being discussed earlier, that how many will be buying sustainable, how aware are we when making our choices. But I think one has to start somewhere, and there will always be a small lobby, across the brands, which will be willing to pay a premium, I think, for sustainability. And it would continue to grow over a period of time. So I think that's how we have to work. Each one of us has to keep doing what we are doing. And this wasn't existing, this awareness wasn't there. Now it's there and it's bound to grow, I think. And more and more people are becoming conscious with the kind of pandemic and kind of climate change issues that are there. Everybody's forced. It's touching everyone now. You can no longer, nobody can say we don't care. But to what extent, I think it's going to take some time, and over a period of time, it's just gonna grow.
Great. So we can wrap this up. Bharti, you can take the closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Lavanya. I want to thank every one of our panelists. I've learned so much. I'm sure everybody else has too. We've really gone through much more than what people can normally in 40 minutes, and we've had some fabulous questions. And even to me, I've known Dr. Deepti Gupta, I think, for about 3 years now, and we've never talked about her work. I've known her through the prism of waste management at IIT, and we've never really, and it's so mind-blowing, the kinds of, insights as an academician she's offered, and also the kinds of insights many of you have offered as practitioners at Shahi Exports, and as people promoting circular fashion. I mean, it's so inspiring because, as an organization that hopes to begin working on this, I mean, all I can say is that I'm quite overwhelmed almost with the knowledge we've gleaned. So a big thank you to all of you, and a big thank you to Lavanya. You were fabulous, absolutely. And of course, all of this wouldn't have been possible without the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, who've been absolutely, so absolutely positive about these kinds of learning and exchange formats. Very, very grateful to them. And to Tamarind Chutney, this was the first time that Chintan kind of partnered, and Tamarind Chutney being a sustainable brand run by women, looking at fair work. It seemed such a fabulous partner. So big gratitude, and please watch out. We have 4 more fabulous webinars coming up and complex thinking webinars like this one on the sharing economy, on furniture, on plastics. So please look out on our social media and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And we hope to see you there as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for everything. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bharti. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Lavanya. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.